They will know we are Christians by our love. That's kind of what we've been talking about for the last several weeks. We've been talking about how to relate to people. And how we've defined that is trying to find common ground to demonstrate that we care in order to build a bridge, if you will, to try and share the gospel. Now, obviously, we want to find common ground and show we care with people who are already members of the church, already who are in a right relationship with God, but specifically our focus has been on trying to relate to those who do not know Christ, because if we don't try and relate, we're not going to be effective in sharing the message. We can give them all the information we want, and if we don't try and go the extra step to build that relationship, to find that common ground, to really demonstrate that we love them, then they're probably not going to listen. We've talked about several things. We've talked about how to relate to those who struggle with addiction, how to relate to those who've been abused, how to relate to those from different cultures, several different ways that we sometimes struggle to relate to people. And that's not particular to us in this room. That's kind of human nature. We struggle to relate to people who are different than us, who have different experiences, who go through different things, who are outside of our circle of experience. So as we look at this idea, as we look at different ways that it can be hard to relate, we're going to move on to another one this morning that I think is very, very relevant for us. We're going to look at how can I relate to someone who struggles with their sexuality. Now, I want to define, as we usually do, what we're talking about here. Yes, we can talk about those who struggle with sexual sin in terms of just what we might, and we're going to talk about this phrasing, but what we might often colloquially call normal sexual sin. And then we could also talk about other types of issues. That's more what we're focusing on this morning. And again, I would argue there's a problem with how we usually talk about it. What we're talking about when we say struggling with our sexuality this morning, we're talking more along the lines of things like sexual identity. Who am I? How do I identify myself sexually? Am I a male, a female, another gender? Am I attracted to men, attracted to women, all these kind of things? I'm saying that not because we need to be thinking in those terms in a legitimate sense, but in the sense that people do legitimately struggle with those questions, even though there are many things the Scripture says about them. So the point we're talking about this morning, how can I relate to someone who is asking those kind of questions, who is struggling with those kinds of things in their lives? Oftentimes, as our normal instinct can be in general, our instinct with those who struggle with their sexuality is one of two things. Either they're too far gone, they're never going to listen. If they're that far to where they're asking those questions, they're never going to listen, and we write them off. Or maybe we don't write them off in that sense, but I don't want to be around those kind of people. Again, I'm not saying that's the right attitude. I'm saying that's often one of the attitudes that we have. I have talked with people, and I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but I've talked with people who legitimately, if someone has those kinds of mindsets, those kind of struggles, those kind of issues, if I touch anything in their house, I've got to wash my hands. They might give me a disease. That's a problem. Let's talk for a moment about the overall point that we need to emphasize as we begin talking about this topic. And that is that sex is a powerful thing. Now, don't worry, I'm going to try very hard not to get explicit in a lot of things we're talking about here, but the fact is, sex is a very powerful force. God designed it to be a very powerful force. In fact, the Bible talks a lot about it. In Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 3, Solomon talks about the appeal of sexual desire as something that is very difficult to resist. He describes this woman who is trying to seduce people. The lips of a forbidden woman, he says, drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil. In other words, everything about this scenario seems to be appealing. It is a very powerful draw. And that is something that ultimately is part of God's design, unfortunately is often abused. Here's the model that we're given. We see this ultimately from the very beginning, right, in Genesis chapter 2, but we also see this later on in the same chapter, Proverbs 5. Let your fountain be blessed, Solomon says. Rejoice with the wife of your youth. And notice this last phrase, be intoxicated always in her love. Now, we often overlook that word, and that's actually, there might be some other translations of that, but intoxicate is actually a very good way to describe this word in the Hebrew. I don't know a whole lot about Hebrew, but I know enough to be able to do a little research on the word and know this literally means intoxicated. This literally means infatuated. This literally means I can think of nothing else. This is consuming me. The relationship that God designed to be reserved for marriage between a man and a woman is designed to be an extremely powerful force. It is designed to be something that ties the two so tightly together that it helps them to overcome the struggles they're going to face in life as a team. It is cementing the bond they should have on every other level of their lives so that they can be able to stick it out together. That is the beauty of God's design. And yet, of course, as we've just seen earlier on in the chapter, it can be used for evil as well as for good. It can be, because it's so powerful, a force that is twisted away from God's design. If you have ever talked with anyone who works in the advertising industry about the general nature of the advertising industry, you probably heard the phrase, sex sells. It's true. It's because it is that powerful. If you watch sporting events, and you have, especially in the professional ones, people who are wearing very revealing clothing. I say people because it's not always women at this point. Why? Oh, well, it's to promote team spirit. Yeah, but you can promote team spirit and not be dressed like that. It's because sex sells. Flee from fornication, Paul would say in 1 Corinthians. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the one committing fornication sins against his own body. You realize that Paul is defining sexual sin as particularly harmful among all the other sins that we could talk about. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body. The one committing fornication sins against his own body. We can talk about all these other different sins. We can talk about lying. We can talk about theft. We can even talk about murder. And he says this one's different because you are hurting your own body. Everything else is external. You are hurting yourself with this one, as well as, of course, the person that you are committing this sin with. So as we begin to talk about this issue, as we begin to talk about those who struggle with their sexuality in various ways, again, we're talking specifically about those who struggle with their sexual identity, who struggle with same-sex attraction, those kinds of things. We need to recognize at the front end, we're not talking about something that's just, oh, I just happen to decide that I like this, and oh, whatever. We're talking about a force that is extremely powerful, is extremely difficult in many cases to escape the grasp of. We should be thinking kind of back to some of the things, and in fact, I believe one of the elders had mentioned to me after this one, when we talked about addiction, we should be thinking about some of the same things here. They've actually done studies in terms of how the brain is wired as it relates to sexual relationships, and the brain can get rewired in many ways because of your sexual activity. And it can release a lot of the same chemicals to a lot of the same concentration that drugs can. It can have the same type of effect. In the right context, again, that's meant to be an intoxicating thing in a positive sense between a man and a wife. That's literally what Solomon says. But if we take that outside of the design and out of the context that God designed it for, all of a sudden we're talking about something that's extremely powerful. Later on in 1 Corinthians 7, notice what Paul says. Because of the temptation to fornication, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. You realize what he's saying? He's just said earlier on in this book, in this letter to the Corinthians, it's really better in the specific situation that we're in if you remain unmarried. it's going to be better for you. You're going to be better off. Now, he's not saying that as a blanket statement. He's saying that specifically because of the hard times and the persecution that Christians were going through at that time. But he says because of the temptation to fornication, by the way, just so we're defining our terms, fornication is specifically a word describing sexual sin, describing, if we're going to be blunt about it, what you would hire a prostitute for. That's literally what the word means. Activity you would hire someone like that for. He says because of the temptation, each one should have their own spouse. It's that powerful. Even though it might be better to do this, I recognize it's so powerful, most people are going to need to get married. God created it to be a powerful thing. He created sex to be this powerful force. But when it's misused, we need to understand, as we're talking about relating to people who struggle with these things, this power is difficult to escape. It's a very difficult thing once you've started down that path. Oftentimes, start down that path without knowledge of what God teaches on the subject. Oftentimes, you start down this path because of influences that have been influencing you in the wrong direction, who've been telling you that this is what you should do, and now it's hard to escape. We need to go in to situations where we're interacting with people who struggle with this, understanding how difficult their situation really is. It's not to excuse it. That's not to say that sin is not sin. Sin, by definition, is what God says is wrong, and that doesn't change. But we need to understand, if we want to help them, what they're facing. Which should lead us to another point that we really shouldn't have to talk about, but we do. There are so many people in, and I'm being very broad in this description, evangelical circles who view things like homosexuality or transgenderism, things like that, as if it is somehow worse, as if it is somehow other, as if it is the pinnacle of sin, even in some people's minds. And some of the arguments that I've heard for that, things like, well, at least if you are, sleeping around or cheating on your husband or your wife, at least that's, kind of natural, right? At least it's still heterosexual. If we're talking about homosexuality or transgender, that's just so unnatural. Really? So you're telling me that this relationship that God created to be between a husband and wife for life, if you violate that with someone of the opposite sex, oh, that's natural. But if you violate that design with any other person, all of a sudden it's unnatural. What does natural mean? By definition, doesn't natural mean according to God's design in the context that we're talking about? No. It's not somehow better to commit sexual sin if it's not in the category of homosexuality, transgenderism. Unnatural is unnatural. The sins we are talking about are sins no matter what we're talking about. And yet somehow, and I'm not saying people in this room, I'm saying us as Christians, and especially using that in a very broad sense, we somehow think, oh, we're so much better than people who would struggle with such things. Oh, yes, maybe I didn't make good decisions before I got married when I was in the dating world. Oh, yes, maybe there were some indiscretions that happened even during my marriage, but at least I'm not a homosexual. Really? Jesus is at a Pharisee's house. A woman enters the house, and she is anointing Jesus' feet. She is weeping to be in the presence of who she realizes to be the Messiah. And all the Pharisee can think, as he sits back there, thinking about how much better he is than her, is, if this man were a prophet, he would have known what sort of woman this is who is touching him, because she is a sinner. Based on the context, most likely, she was a sinner in some sort of sexual way. Just, again, this is the best that we can tell from the situation, the context. And his whole attitude is, oh yeah, I'm obviously better. Have we learned nothing from 2,000 years of reading the scriptures of how Jesus handled the Pharisees. That we still, 2,000 years later, somehow think of those who struggle with different sins than we do as if we're better than them. Because I do struggle with sin, but it's not that sin. Another Pharisee, in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, they're in the temple. The Pharisee standing by and he says, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. Oh yes, Lord, I have my sins that I struggle with, but they're the ones that aren't as bad. I'm thankful I'm not like those homosexuals. I'm thankful I'm not like those people who've abandoned their gender for something else. I'm not like them. If you look at the statistics, there's really not much difference in the statistics within the religious world, the Christian world, again, using it broadly, but even if we apply it specifically to the church, there's not much difference between that and the general world that we live in American society. In terms of sexual activity before marriage, in terms of pornography use, in terms of divorce and spousal unfaithfulness, all those things are happening within the church. Oh, but we're better. Because at least those are all normal sexual sins. What is normal? Normal is how God designed us to be. If it's not that, it's not normal. It's not right. It's a violation of nature. It's a violation of God's design. We don't have the right to sit there and say, oh yeah, we went a little too far before we got married. But at least we got married. We're nowhere close to that. In Romans 1, Paul goes pretty hard as he is trying to emphasize the sins that many Gentiles have fallen into and the state that they were in before hearing about Christianity. And you can just hear the Jews who are now in Rome, the Christian Jews who are listening to Romans chapter 1. Oh yeah, get it, Paul. Yeah, those Gentiles, all these things that they've done. And Paul turns around as he begins chapter 2. He turns and looks right at the Jews. He says, you have no excuse. You who judge every one of you in passing judgment on another condemns yourself because you've been doing the very same things. I'm not at all saying we should not recognize sin as sin. I'm not at all saying that somehow we should give a pass to sin. I'm saying we better do it the right way, understanding that just because we don't struggle with the same sins as someone else, that doesn't mean we don't struggle with sin, and that sin is not any more displeasing to God than the sins that are being committed in other people's lives. The second we try and have an interaction with someone who struggles with something like homosexuality or gender dysphoria, gender identity issues, whatever the case might be, the second we try and approach them and try and have a conversation with them, open a dialogue, have a relationship with them, ultimately with the goal of sharing the gospel with them, if we go into that relationship already feeling like we're superior, we've already lost. Even if somehow we are able to get past that in terms of how we present ourselves and convince them to understand and obey the gospel, if that remains our attitude, we've still lost. Maybe we haven't lost the effort with them, but we're losing the effort with ourselves. Because we are allowing ourselves to be prideful because my sin isn't as bad as yours. Now, I'm very much opposed to the idea that because all sin is sin, that means all the consequences of sin are the same. Obviously, there are some sins that have worse consequences than others in terms of this physical world and the things related to that and different levels of harm that can be caused to others because of my sin. Yes, there are differences in that sense. But I don't care what sin you have committed. The tiniest one by how we rate them sometimes. That sin is enough to keep you out of heaven. And until we have that mindset in any interaction that we're trying to go into with others, in any sin that they might struggle with that we're trying to help them ultimately see the truth about, Until we have that mindset that my sin is still enough to keep me out of heaven, no matter how different it is from theirs, we are going to be very, very vulnerable to the kind of pride that we've been talking about here. Yes, some sins have worse consequences than others. Yes, some sins are harder to escape than others. Yes, some sins have a greater publicity than others. All those things we can talk about. That doesn't give me a right to look down on those with different struggles. None. Well, no, I understand that, but no. None. That person, whoever they are, whatever they've done, is a soul that can be made right with God, just like I can be made right with God. And if I have obeyed the gospel, have been made right with God. The same thing is possible for them. I want the same thing for them. And I want them to be part of the family that I'm a part of, to be my family without any kind of, oh, but you're that. Yes, you're the family now, but you're the stepchild. One other thing, as we wrap up. This is something that oftentimes we don't do a good job of recognizing. Are there people who have gone down this path, who are very adamant, very, how shall I put this, combative, hostile about their choices? Meaning, if you let on a whiff of, I personally don't agree with what you're doing, I don't think it's right, they will just absolutely go off on you, call you hateful and bigoted and all this kind of thing. Are there people who follow that kind of way? Absolutely. Absolutely. I know people who are like that. I can't help that. We need to understand something. Not everyone who struggles with these issues falls in that category. Not everyone, for example, who is a homosexual falls into the category of militant, trying to force everyone to celebrate their point of view and their lifestyle, trying to attack anyone who disagrees with them, trying to shut down churches who would teach against it. Not everyone who falls into this category of struggling with these sins is like that. In fact, you realize a lot of people who struggle with these things, they were abused, often as children, or they were abused as an adult, or they were bullied, or they have some kind of significant issue with their mental health, or a whole number of other things. It's not to say everyone. A lot of people, that is a contributing factor to this struggle. Now, the world hates that. The world will do everything they can to shut down anyone who would suggest such a thing. But the fact is, it's true. If you look at the statistics, even the statistics that people who try and support this kind of lifestyle will put out there, the statistics are there. They just try to cover them up. I'm going to share a very brief story. Individual, I don't know him personally, but he, I believe, I can't remember if it was because of like a family being in the mission field or something like that, but I believe was kind of raised in a quote-unquote Christian household. But whatever the reason, was born in another country. In this country, I'll just use the word without defining it, they don't practice circumcision when you're born. That was never changed. So they grew up being an uncircumcised male. Moved back to the States, would participate in sports in high school. When you're in the locker room, oftentimes that kind of stuff becomes obvious. And all the boys teased him, saying no girl would ever want to be with him because he was uncircumcised. So for years, he became a homosexual because he had been told all of his life, no girl will ever want you, so he said, well, maybe a guy will. Doesn't mean the decision was right. Doesn't mean his lifestyle while he was going through that period of his life, and by the way, he eventually changed. Doesn't mean any of that was right. That choice was right. But you don't know why someone's in the position they are. You don't know the things that people have done to them potentially that have hurt them, and this is a coping mechanism. Again, that's not always the situation. But don't add to the problem. Jesus said, those who are well, they don't have need of a physician. Those who are sick have need of a physician. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And yet, how many of us, if we have the choice, try and avoid people who struggle with these things? They're the ones who need us the most. Again, some who are militant and who are completely just will not listen to anyone who even gives a hint to disagree with them. Sometimes we have to say, okay, I'm always here if you want to talk, and go from there. But there are a lot of people, if we would try and relate to them, there are a lot of people who would listen. There are a lot of people who would be friends with us. Oh, but I don't want those kind of friends. Yeah, that's what the Pharisees said about Jesus. Oh, he has those kind of friends. Do you not know, if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are the slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness. You know, we have a history in our country. We have a history of, after the Civil War, generally speaking, and I'm saying this in both a hopeful and a statistical way, we have a history of being very anti-slavery because of a lot of things that happened before in our history. When we see slavery around the world, or forms of it that maybe aren't called slavery, we get upset. We talk about human rights violations. We talk about wanting to free those who are in slavery. People who are caught in sin, especially powerful sins like sexual sins, they're in slavery. And oftentimes our instinct is, oh, nothing to do with me, instead of how can I help them be free? I've heard people talk about before, I wish I lived during the days when slavery was legal in the United States because I would buy as many slaves as I could and set them free. It's a lovely sentiment. I appreciate it. I understand that there's some nuance to the situation in American slavery and all that, but appreciate the sentiment. But you have the chance to do something like that with a slavery that's much more heinous, a slavery that's got way worse consequences. Because this slavery lasts into eternity unless they are set free. And we're the ones who can offer freedom. The woman is brought to Jesus. Ironically, just her, not the man. A sexual sin has been committed. She is married, but she has been with another man. The Pharisees want to stone her. In fact, they want Jesus to stone her. They're using it as a trap. You remember what Jesus says? After he tells the Pharisees, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone, and they all leave. Because for once, their conscience actually kicked in and they were convicted. The woman is standing there, everyone else has left. And Jesus gets up from where he's been writing in the ground in the sand, and stands there in the street and looks at the woman. He asks where her accusers are. She says, they've all left. He says, I'm not going to condemn you either. He says, go and sin no more. Now I want you to notice what he just did. Did he say what she did was right? No, he explicitly says she did sin. He knows she committed the sin that has been discussed. His point is, I'm not interested in beating you down over what you've done. I'm interested in helping you move forward from what you've done. Is that our attitude? As we encounter those who struggle with these kinds of sins, is that our attitude? I'm not interested in beating you over the head with what you've done. I am interested in getting you to repent, in convincing you that what you've been doing is wrong. I am interested in that. But I'm interested in that so that we can all move forward, so that you can be in a right relationship with God. That's what I'm interested in. That's the end goal. Is that our attitude? Because if it's not, well, it's Jesus' attitude. And that should carry some weight with us if nothing else does. Those who struggle with these issues, again, they're often victims of bullying, abuse, all sorts of things. We don't know. Just like any other situation, we don't know what's gone on in that person's life. We need to be careful in how we approach them, not to make such problems even worse. You realize that people can use Scripture to bully other people, just like they can use anything else. That's not to say telling someone that something is sin is bullying. It's saying that how we do it can be done in a wrong way. How we do it can be done in an unloving way. As we've tried to say so many times, we are to speak the truth in love. If I speak truth and it's not loving, that doesn't cut it. Any more than if I'm loving and don't have the truth. If we want to reach people with the gospel, we must be willing to help them overcome their struggles instead of treating them like damaged goods, like other, like second-class citizens, whatever phrase we want to put in. Because, I would argue, in large part, of a lot of social and political situations in our country, we are often tempted not to handle these situations like Jesus would, but to handle them like those around us would. But we have a higher calling than that. And that's what we need to remember. If there's any way we can encourage you, pray for you, help you this morning, we always want to do that. We always want to let you know that we are ready to help in whatever way we can. If you need to learn more about the gospel, if you need to just have help with whatever you're struggling with, we're all trying to overcome our struggles and be right with God. So if there is something we can do, please let us know as we stand and sing. If the name of the Savior is precious to you, if his care has been